It was supposed to be a normal Monday morning in downtown Chicago, gray clouds pressing against the skyline, the streets humming with the quiet rhythm of ambition. A man stepped out of a black Tesla, wearing a simple navy suit and a soft wool coat. No security detail, no entourage, no performance. Just a man with purpose in his stride, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had traveled with him through every milestone of his career. No one looking at him would have guessed that he was Malcolm Price, the founder and CEO of Helix Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing tech conglomerates in the nation. His name adorned the marble lobby upstairs, etched into the metal plaque beside the elevator banks. But he hadn't set foot in this building for over a year. After months of silent philanthropy and private board meetings, Malcolm had decided to show up unannounced, hoping to reconnect with the heartbeat of the company he built from scratch. He wanted to see the people who made it all work, to remind them that leadership was not about distance but presence. But as he entered the shimmering glass doors of his own creation, the atmosphere shifted. The young receptionist, her eyes glued to a monitor, barely looked up when she spoke. The security guard by the desk, tall, broad, and visibly uneasy, began eyeing him with suspicion. Malcolm smiled politely, expecting recognition. None came. "Sir," the guard voice eventually cut to the hum of morning chatter, "this area is for authorized personnel only." Malcolm paused, confusion washing over him. His face, calm, refined, familiar to business magazines and investor panels, suddenly seemed invisible here. He reached into his pocket for his ID badge, but before he could present it, two more guards approached. The room's energy had turned cold, clinical. People were starting to stare. And in that suspended moment, in the very lobby named after him, the billionaire realized something painfully familiar. They didn't see who he was. They only saw what he looked like. Malcolm Price had always believed in hard work over headlines. Long before he became a billionaire, before Forbes called him the quiet genius of Chicago tech, he had been the boy who fixed discarded computers from neighbors' trash cans. His mother, Evelyn, worked double shifts as a nurse and reminded him every night that excellence is the loudest protest. She raised him in the South Side, a neighborhood that taught him grit, empathy, and how to read the silence in people's eyes. Helix Dynamics was his rebellion against invisibility. It started in a cramped apartment where he coded through the nights, powered by coffee, broken dreams, and the quiet rage of being underestimated. He had seen doors close in his face, venture capitalists who loved his idea until they saw the color of his skin. He remembered shaking hands that quickly retracted once the introductions were over. Every rejection had built a quiet storm in him, not of anger, but of discipline. By 42, Malcolm had become an icon in the tech industry, though he never acted like one. He believed technology could humanize business, automate fairness, not just profit. His company built cloud infrastructure and AI ethics systems for Fortune 500 clients, but his vision was always deeper: to make tech an instrument of equality. When he founded Helix, he promised himself that his employees would never experience the kind of prejudice he had endured. He hired based on merit, funded diversity programs, and paid for scholarships in underrepresented schools. But success had a strange side effect. The larger the company grew, the less connected he became to its ground level. The executives handled culture reports, HR memos, diversity audits, all filtered and sanitized by corporate polish. Malcolm wanted to see the real company again. That's why he arrived unannounced, without calling ahead or alerting his board. What he found in the lobby that morning was a sobering truth. The building he once walked through freely now felt foreign. The receptionist's forced politeness, the guard's wary eyes, all of it reminded him of his first investor meeting years ago, when a security officer had mistaken him for the janitor. He thought those days were behind him. As the guards subtly tightened their formation, Malcolm noticed the details that made his company what it was. The chrome Helix logo on the wall, the framed photos of product launches, the diversity pledge engraved on a plaque near the front desk. Irony echoed through the marble. "Sir, we need you to step back," one of the guards said again, his hand resting lightly on his belt, not threatening but instinctive. Malcolm kept his composure, his voice low, controlled. But inside, old memories stirred. Classrooms where teachers ignored his raised hand. Banks that denied his first business loan without reason. investors who assumed he was his assistant. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't wanted to admit for years. Even billionaires weren't immune. Money could buy access, but not perception. One of the guards called for a supervisor, murmuring into his earpiece. A few employees began whispering nearby, some glancing curiously, others trying not to stare. The receptionist looked visibly uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that something was off. Malcolm stood quietly, refusing to escalate. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He glanced up at the ceiling, the skylight he had personally approved during the building's design phase. He had wanted sunlight to pour into the lobby, to symbolize transparency and openness. Now, it felt like the light was mocking him. When the floor manager finally appeared, clipboard in hand and irritation on her face, she scanned Malcolm from head to toe before asking, "Can I help you?" The tone wasn't curious. It was dismissive, routine. She didn't recognize him either. Malcolm realized that anonymity in his own space had become a privilege he didn't want. He gave his name quietly. The woman blinked, unsure she'd heard right. Then she looked at the receptionist's monitor, where his face was displayed under Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The blood drained from her cheeks. The guard stepped back. The silence was instant and heavy. Malcolm didn't move. He only looked at her, not with anger, but with that haunting calm that comes when a man realizes the weight of what hasn't changed. The silence in the lobby was suffocating, thick with shock, guilt, and the faint echo of whispered apologies. Malcolm didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look on the floor manager's face, pale, tight, and trembling, told the entire story. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, their professional confidence unraveling. The receptionist fidgeted with her keyboard, pretending to search for something, as though burying her eyes in the monitor could make the last 10 minutes disappear. Malcolm finally gave a polite nod, his voice measured, almost too calm. "I'd like to see my office," he said simply. No one stopped him this time. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the moment he stepped inside, the reflection staring back at him in the mirrored walls felt distant. For years, he had convinced himself that progress had rewritten the rules, that respect had become a matter of merit, not color. But the last few minutes had reminded him that progress was not permanent. It was fragile, conditional, and easily forgotten. As the elevator rose, he thought of the irony. Helix Dynamics was known for its diversity campaigns, featured on magazine covers and social media. "Building equality through innovation," the tagline read. He had personally signed off on those words. Yet here he was, treated like an intruder by the very culture he'd spent years shaping. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the tone changed instantly. Assistants rushed from cubicles, faces brightening in recognition. "Mr. Price, we didn't know you were coming." Cameras were subtly lifted. Whispers of "he's here" rippled to the corridor. The contrast hit him hard. Downstairs, suspicion. Upstairs, reverence. The same building, the same man, but two different worlds. His assistant, Lila, appeared with a mixture of surprise and relief. "We would have prepared," she began, but he raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "Don't," he said softly. Preparation shouldn't be a requirement for respect. She fell silent, understanding. Malcolm walked toward his office, a vast glass space overlooking the city he once conquered. It still smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the signature scent he'd chosen when Helix first moved in. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the window, glittering with promise and contradiction. He set his briefcase on the desk, leaned against the edge, and exhaled. He remembered the first time he'd signed a lease for this building. He was 35, and no one had believed a black founder could secure financing for such an ambitious headquarters. They'd called him overconfident and idealistic. Yet he did it, and he thought that would be the end of the battle. But battles never really end. They just change their uniforms. When the head of human resources arrived, flustered, anxious, clutching her tablet, she began a flurry of explanations. "Mr. Price, I'm so sorry about what happened downstairs. We've already spoken to security. It's a misunderstanding." He looked at her, eyes calm but sharp. "A misunderstanding," he repeated slowly. "That took 3 employees to enforce." She froze. Malcolm wasn't raising his voice. He never did. But his words carried the weight of decades of quiet endurance. "Do you know what's worse than bias?" he asked softly. "It's when people who should know better stop seeing it because they're too comfortable calling it a misunderstanding." He didn't want apologies. He wanted accountability. Later that afternoon, he walked the floors unannounced, from engineering to marketing, from the cafeteria to the loading dock. He watched how people interacted, who got greeted first, who got ignored. It didn't take long to notice the pattern. Subtle but visible, like hairline cracks beneath glossy paint. Black employees clustered near one another during breaks. Few of them occupied corner offices. The upper floors were a different world, quiet, insulated, mostly white. He saw himself reflected in the janitor who pushed a cart down the hall, eyes down, invisible to the executives walking past. Malcolm stopped, thanked him for keeping the place spotless, and shook his hand. The man blinked in surprise. No one had ever done that before. That night, long after most had gone home, Malcolm sat alone in the boardroom, staring at the company's diversity metrics projected on the wall. The numbers looked impressive, percentages, targets, and glowing PR phrases. But numbers could lie. They didn't capture silence, glances, or the ache of not belonging. He opened his notebook, the same one he'd carried since his startup days, and wrote 3 words. Culture is truth. The next morning, he called an emergency leadership meeting. Executives shuffled in, tired, curious, nervous. Most didn't know what had happened in the lobby. Some assumed it was a quarterly update. But when Malcolm began speaking, the air grew still. "I walked into this building yesterday," he said evenly, "and was told to leave." No one moved. "I want you to sit with that for a moment," he continued. "Not because it happened to me, but because it could have happened to anyone who doesn't fit someone else's assumption of power." He let the silence hang. "Helix was supposed to be different," he said, voice tightening slightly. "We built technology to remove bias from algorithms, yet we've allowed it to live in our halls." Some executives lowered their eyes. Others fidgeted. One began to speak, but Malcolm raised a hand. "This isn't about embarrassment. It's about honesty. We've been marketing diversity as a strength, but if we can't live it here, then we're not just hypocrites, we're part of the problem." The words sank deep. Even those who'd always admired him felt uncomfortable, as if the mirror he held up was showing something they'd rather not see. He paused, scanning the room. The same people who once called him visionary, now silent before the truth of their own complicity. "I'm not here to fire anyone," he said quietly. "But I am here to rebuild what we lost, not reputation, but respect." He closed his notebook and stood, signaling the end of the meeting. But everyone knew this was just the beginning of something larger, a reckoning not with policy, but with conscience. As he walked out of the boardroom, his reflection shimmered on the glass, no longer invisible, but heavier, older, and far more aware of the empire he created. The week that followed was unlike anything Helix Dynamics had ever experienced. Malcolm's quiet, unannounced visit had turned into an internal earthquake. Word spread quickly, whispered in hallways, traded over Slack messages, debated during lunch breaks. Employees of color moved differently now, half proud that their CEO had lived their silent frustrations, half anxious about what might happen next. The board members, many of them veterans of corporate diplomacy, scrambled to control the narrative. Public relations teams drafted statements in case the story leaked to the media. But Malcolm didn't want damage control. He wanted transformation. He refused to let this moment die as a headline or a footnote. 3 days after the meeting, he called for an all-hands assembly, the first in the company's history. Over 2,000 employees filled the grand atrium, from janitors to engineers, from interns to executives. Cameras were not allowed. No press, just the people of Helix and the man who had built it. Malcolm stepped onto the stage in the same Navy suit he'd worn the day he was told to leave the lobby. No microphone tricks, no slideshow, just him and the truth. He looked around at the sea of faces, some curious, some defensive, others already on the edge of tears. Then he began. "I started Helix because I believed technology could make the world fairer," he said, his voice deep, deliberate. "But technology is only as fair as the people behind it. And somewhere along the line, we forgot that." He paused, scanning the room. A few days ago, I walked into this building, my building, and was asked to leave. That moment wasn't about me. It was about the quiet bias that lives in the corners we don't want to look at. The crowd was utterly silent. He walked slowly across the stage, hands clasped behind him. The receptionist who didn't look up, the guards who assumed I didn't belong. They weren't villains. They were mirrors. They reflected a system that still teaches people to make assumptions about value, worth, and belonging based on what they see, not who stand before them. A murmur ran through the audience, a collective unease mixed with recognition. Some employees nodded subtly. Others avoided eye contact. Malcolm continued, his tone tightening just slightly. I've read every diversity report this company has ever produced. They're beautiful, impressive, but equality on paper doesn't mean equality in practice. If people in this building still feel unseen, unheard, or uninvited, then we failed. He took a deep breath, his eyes softening. This isn't about guilt, it's about awareness. Because bias doesn't need hate to exist, it only needs silence. A hush fell over the room, dense and electric. I'm not here to punish anyone, he went on, but I am here to change everything. Starting today, every employee, from the C-suite to security, will undergo immersive cultural empathy training. Not a 1-hour seminar, not a checkbox exercise, but a lived experience. Every team will be mentored by the people this company was built to serve. And I'll be right there with you. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had expected this level of involvement from him. But that's not all, Malcolm said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. We're restructuring our leadership evaluation system. Promotions won't be based solely on performance metrics. They'll also measure inclusion, accountability, and how leaders treat the people who serve them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the atrium, a soft clap broke the stillness, hesitant but heartfelt. Another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the applause became thunderous, rolling through the space like a wave of release. Malcolm didn't smile. He only nodded, humbled, resolute. The applause wasn't victory. It was recognition. But the true climax didn't end on that stage. A few hours later, as the crowd dispersed, the same security guard who had stopped Malcolm days before appeared outside his office. His eyes were nervous but sincere. "Sir," he said, voice shaking slightly, "I wanted to say, I didn't know. I just thought—" Malcolm raised a hand gently. "You thought what you were taught to think," he said. "But now you know better. So teach others." The guard's shoulders trembled as he nodded, emotion flooding his eyes. He extended a hand. Malcolm shook it without hesitation. That handshake, small, quiet, almost invisible to the world, felt more powerful than any applause that morning. Later that evening, Malcolm stood once more in the lobby, the same place where humiliation had met him days ago. The same receptionist was at the desk, though this time her eyes lifted immediately. She offered a genuine, if uncertain, smile. "Good evening, Mr. Price," she said softly. He nodded, then turned his gaze upward to the plaque beside the elevator. Helix Dynamics, founded on vision, built on equality. He had written those words himself years ago. For the first time, he truly understood how far they had yet to go. As the elevator doors closed, Malcolm didn't feel angry anymore. He felt something more dangerous. Purpose. He realized the real revolution wasn't in software algorithms or innovation. It was in the everyday courage to confront prejudice where it hid, in lobbies, meetings, and unspoken glances. And that revolution had just begun. In the weeks that followed, Helix Dynamics changed in ways no one had expected. It wasn't the press releases or polished videos that marked the shift. It was the tone of the hallways, the new weight of conversations, the silences that began to break. For the first time, people were truly seeing each other. The diversity slogans that once hung like corporate wallpaper suddenly meant something more. Malcolm didn't announce new products or expansion plans. He turned his focus inward, toward the heart of the company, its people. Every department received an open invitation to attend something called the Mirror Sessions. It wasn't a seminar or a lecture. It was storytelling. Employees sat in circles, sometimes for hours, sharing their experiences of bias, fear, and invisibility, not just racial, but social, gendered, economic. The stories were raw, unfiltered, and human. Executives who had built walls of corporate poise found themselves speechless as custodians, engineers, and junior analysts spoke of daily indignities they had quietly endured. One black woman described how she avoided the elevator during executive hours because she was tired of being mistaken for a cleaner. Another employee, a Latina software designer, confessed that she often felt her accent erase her credibility. Each story cut deep, but each one also began to heal something. Malcolm attended every session. He didn't speak much. He listened, really listened. Sometimes he sat in the back, silent, hands folded, absorbing the emotions in the room like a storm cloud gathering light. He understood that leadership wasn't about having answers. It was about making space for truth. Outside the company walls, rumors began to swirl. Journalists caught wind of his lobby incident, though the details remained vague. Some speculated that he was preparing for a massive rebranding. Others claimed it was a publicity stunt. But Malcolm refused interviews. He didn't want the story to be about him. He wanted it to be about the why. 2 months later, Helix hosted an internal summit called the Redefinition Project. It wasn't open to the public. The entire event centered on one theme: what belonging truly means. Employees presented ideas, data, and personal reflections on rebuilding company culture. They discussed unconscious bias detection tools, mentorship pipelines for underrepresented staff, and equity audits that measure not just pay gaps, but respect gaps. At the close of the summit, Malcolm stood on stage once again. This time not as a man confronting a crisis, but as someone witnessing transformation in motion. The auditorium lights dimmed, and behind him, a large projection displayed photos of the company's earliest days. His old apartment filled with tangled cords, Evelyn, his mother, smiling proudly beside a second-hand computer, the first small Helix office above a laundromat. He took a deep breath before speaking. "When my mother was alive," he said softly, "she told me that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you refuse to let them take." He paused. "I forgot that once. I thought if I built something big enough, powerful enough, I'd finally be seen for what I was, not what I looked like. But the truth is, the world doesn't change just because you make it successful. It changes when you make it accountable." His voice wavered, but not from weakness. It was the weight of realization and release. He looked across the faces in the crowd, young, old, white, black, brown, all watching him with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with wealth. "Every building we raise, every line of code we write, every decision we make, all means nothing if people still feel small in the shadow of it," he said. "We don't need to be perfect. We just need to be aware." A quiet tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. After the summit, small miracles began to unfold, invisible, ordinary revolutions. The guard who had stopped him that morning was promoted to lead diversity safety initiatives, working directly with HR to train new recruits. The receptionist who looked past and became part of a culture task force that helped redesign the company's onboarding process to teach empathy through personal stories. For the first time, Helix Dynamics began to look like the future it had always promised to build. Months later, as winter rolled across Chicago, Malcolm visited a local high school to fund a new computer science program for underprivileged kids. The principal introduced him to a group of students who looked at him with awe. Some shy, some bold, all curious. "Is it true you got kicked out of your own company?" one of them asked nervously. Malcolm smiled gently. "I wasn't kicked out," he said. "I was reminded of how far we still have to go." The room went quiet. He looked at those young faces, reflections of his younger self, and felt something deep settle inside him. This was his real legacy. Not the skyscraper with his name on it, not the billions, but the ability to make someone believe they belonged before the world told them otherwise. That evening, as he drove back through the city, he passed the Helix Tower, its logo gleaming against the dark. The same building where he had once been told to leave now glowed like a promise renewed. He parked his car nearby, stepped out, and gazed up at the lights. Somewhere inside, thousands of people were working, coding, creating, growing, in a culture finally learning to see without assumption. And for the first time in years, Malcolm felt peace. Not because the battle was over, but because it was being fought in the right way. He whispered to the cold night air, as if speaking to his mother. "We did it, Ma. Not perfectly, but honestly." The wind carried her memory back to him, the sound of her voice telling him to keep standing tall. And he did. Because sometimes the greatest revolution begins not with anger or protest, but with a simple act of a man walking into his own building and refusing to leave unseen ever again.